It began in the spring of 1944, when the skies over Europe belonged to chaos. German flak clouds hung like bruises over the continent, and Allied bombers fell in black smoke and fire, torn apart by Messerschmitts that owned the air. Every morning, airfields across England sent out streams of silver bombers with their nervous escorts, the P-47 Thunderbolts and early P-51 Mustangs, to strike deep into occupied territory. Many never came back. The German Luftwaffe was confident. Their fuel was scarce, their pilots weary, but their planes were still fierce hunters. The Bf-109s and Fw-190s climbed higher and struck faster, their dive attacks devastating. Allied airmen whispered that the Luftwaffe still had an edge in the upper skies, the kind of edge that could not be outflown, only outthought. And somewhere inside a quiet laboratory in Britain, a small group of American engineers and chemists were about to do just that. They weren't pilots or generals. They were scientists, men of beakers, valves, and equations, who believed that the next phase of the war would be won not by bullets, but by molecules. In secret, they began experimenting with a new aviation fuel blend, one so volatile it could melt a piston if mixed wrong. It was called 150-octane fuel, a potent, high-compression mixture designed to extract every last ounce of speed from the Mustang's Merlin engine. While the Luftwaffe struggled to refine even basic aviation fuel under Allied bombing, the Americans had perfected something that bordered on alchemy. The test flights began quietly at first, without fanfare or briefing. A few Mustangs were filled with the new fuel, their engines carefully tuned for maximum power. The pilots who took them up came back pale-faced, not from fear but disbelief. Their altimeters had reached numbers that seemed impossible. Their airspeed indicators crept beyond 470, 480, 490 miles per hour. The P-51, already respected, had transformed overnight into something else, a beast of the air, a 490 miles per hour demon cloaked in silver. No one outside the testing circles knew what was happening. Reports were buried and flight logs sanitized. But in the quiet hangars of East Anglia, mechanics exchanged glances that carried the weight of secret power. They had seen it. They had heard it, the low, demonic growl of the Merlin engine, surging like never before. Meanwhile, across the channel, German commanders were preparing a counteroffensive in the air. The Reich still had hundreds of seasoned pilots, and their confidence rested on years of domination. They believed their planes could outclimb, outgun, and outrun anything the Allies could throw at them. They didn't know that the balance of the sky had already shifted, silently, invisibly, through chemistry. The first real test came one cloudy morning over northern France. A formation of B-17 bombers droned toward a rail yard near Amiens, escorted by a few dozen Mustangs. The Luftwaffe was waiting, its radar screens lighting up with the familiar swarm. The German fighters climbed fast, cutting through the clouds like blades. But as the battle unfolded, something strange happened. The German pilots couldn't close the gap. Every time they tried to catch the Mustangs, the silver fighters pulled away with impossible speed. The Luftwaffe commanders thought it was pilot error or faulty instruments. But their aces, veterans of hundreds of dogfights, were confused, even alarmed. They'd never seen American fighters move like this. Above 25,000 feet, where thin air usually slowed Allied planes, the Mustangs only grew stronger. Their engines roared as if fed by fire itself. The Germans tried to chase and couldn't. They tried to dive and couldn't shake pursuit. What should have been a routine interception turned into a slaughter. Hours later, when the surviving German pilots limped back to base, their reports sounded like delirium. They spoke of Mustangs that came from nowhere, that vanished into the clouds with unnatural acceleration. Their commanders dismissed it as panic, exhaustion, or propaganda. But those who had seen it firsthand knew better. Something had changed. In the following weeks, the pattern repeated. American squadrons reported unheard-of kill ratios. Luftwaffe radar units tracked aircraft moving faster than any known propeller plane could. And deep inside Allied intelligence offices, a quiet directive was issued. The new 150-octane fuel was to remain top secret. Even Allied pilots weren't told exactly what made their planes faster, only that they were to expect improved performance. But secrets like these never stayed buried for long. German scientists began analyzing the wreckage of downed Mustangs and captured fuel canisters. They noticed traces of additives, chemical signatures that didn't match any known blend. Their best chemists tried to replicate it and failed. Under constant bombing, with crude oil refineries in ruins, they simply didn't have the means to produce such refined power. To the men in the air, the results spoke for themselves. Every encounter with the upgraded Mustangs ended the same way. German planes burning, pilots ejecting into cold European skies, and Allied formations flying home intact. In the officers' mess of Luftwaffe command, whispers grew louder. Some said the Americans had developed a magic engine. Others believed it was a new form of injection or supercharger technology. No one guessed that the secret lay not in steel or mechanics, but in something far more volatile. By the time German intelligence finally pieced together the truth, it was already too late. The skies over Europe were changing hands, one dogfight at a time. And while the pilots fought, the men behind the curtain, the chemists, the engineers, the fuel refiners, watched history tilt in their favor. The silent revolution had begun. The age of the Luftwaffe was ending. The age of the 150-octane Mustang was about to begin. The transformation didn't happen overnight, at least not in the official records. But in the air, where the war's pulse beat loudest, the change was undeniable. By late spring of 1944, Allied pilots who once struggled to survive each mission were now returning with confidence, their squadrons intact, their fuel gauges still generous. Somewhere in the invisible mechanics of the war, the tide had turned. It wasn't through new tactics or a sudden wave of reinforcements. It was the quiet work of chemistry, that volatile 150-octane fuel seeping through the veins of the P-51 Mustang like liquid fire. Across airfields in southern England, the crews began to notice it first. The mechanics who tuned engines and wiped oil from their hands were the first witnesses to a new kind of power. The engines didn't just hum anymore. They roared, smooth and unbroken, as if straining against gravity itself. Pilots returning from missions spoke in low, incredulous tones about acceleration that seemed unreal, climbs that felt effortless, and chases that ended before they truly began. They didn't know the secret. They weren't supposed to. But in the silence between sorties, a feeling grew, a sense that their planes were no longer just machines. They were something more. Meanwhile, across the channel, the Germans were unraveling. For years, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies with a mix of arrogance and precision. Its aces had become legends, men like Hartmann and Galland, who believed they could read the air like a book. But now, that book had changed. The pages no longer made sense. German intelligence units began filing reports filled with disbelief. Pilots claimed that American Mustangs could now dive faster than their own FW-190s. A physical impossibility, according to every table of aerodynamics they possessed. Reconnaissance units documented Mustangs intercepting targets hundreds of miles deeper into occupied territory than before. The math didn't add up. The Luftwaffe's command blamed poor training, fuel shortages, even morale. They couldn't accept that the Americans had found a technological edge so profound it rendered experience irrelevant. Yet, deep down, the more analytical minds knew something extraordinary was happening. In one intercepted Allied briefing, German codebreakers stumbled upon a phrase that froze them: enhanced performance, new fuel specification. It meant nothing to the untrained reader, but to a German chemist buried in a bunker outside Berlin, it was the first clue. A new fuel. That was the key. But knowing was one thing, recreating it was another. Germany's refineries were crippled. Synthetic fuel plants struggled to operate under the constant thunder of Allied bombing raids. Each strike made it harder to produce even basic aviation fuel, let alone something as advanced as what the Allies now seemed to possess. And while the Reich's chemists scrambled, the Mustangs flew, higher, faster, further. The skies above Europe began to change in ways no one had predicted. American bomber formations that once required dense fighter escorts now moved with relative freedom. Luftwaffe interception rates plummeted. German radar operators began noticing strange blips. P-51s flying deeper into German territory, even approaching targets once considered untouchable. In the war rooms, German generals stared at maps covered in red lines, the paths of Allied raids that no longer ended in retreat. The question no one could answer was simple: what had changed? But the answer was already roaring over their heads. At 30,000 feet, a new generation of Mustang pilots was rewriting air warfare. They called their planes angels with claws because that's what they felt like. Divine machines blessed with the gift of impossible speed. Dogfights that once lasted 10 minutes now ended in seconds. A Bf-109 might appear in the distance, roll into an attack, and before it even lined up a shot, the Mustang was already behind it, its 6 50 caliber guns lighting up the sky. From the ground, German civilians began to notice something eerie. The skies that had once thundered with Luftwaffe patrols now echoed with a different sound. The deep, throaty growl of American engines cutting through the air in perfect, terrifying harmony. The psychological impact was immense. The Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility began to fracture. Pilots who once swaggered through hangars now avoided each other's eyes. Their kill counts stopped growing. Some were too afraid to even admit what they'd seen. Mustangs that climbed like rockets, that outpaced them in dives, that refused to stall even at impossible altitudes. On the Allied side, confidence bloomed. The airmen no longer feared crossing into German airspace. They went looking for trouble, and they found it. Squadrons began hunting the Luftwaffe instead of merely escorting bombers. In briefing rooms, maps filled with red pins began to thin. Airfields that had once teemed with German fighters now stood empty or bombed out. The Allies were bleeding the Luftwaffe dry, one engagement at a time, and most of it was thanks to the 150-octane miracle. What the German High Command didn't know was that the new fuel had also changed tactics. Mustang pilots could now throttle higher, climb longer, and engage at altitudes that once belonged only to the enemy. Their range had increased dramatically, thanks to efficient burn at higher compression. This meant the bombers, the heart of Allied strategy, could now fly to Berlin and back with fighter cover the entire way. Berlin. That word alone sent chills through the Reich. The thought of Allied bombers reaching the capital with full escort was once unthinkable. Now, it was a weekly reality. Every mission proved the same pattern. German fighters scrambled, tried to intercept, and vanished, either shot down, outmaneuvered, or forced to retreat. Those who survived reported one thing over and over: the Mustangs were too fast. In desperation, the Germans began testing experimental fuels of their own, crude mixes with high volatility and low stability. Engines overheated, detonated, or exploded mid-flight. What America had refined through science, Germany tried to force through panic and paid the price. By the end of the summer, Allied command knew they had achieved something irreversible. The P-51 was no longer just a fighter. It was the final word in air superiority. Every battle it entered tilted history a little further. But the pilots didn't think in such terms. To them, it was simpler. They were just doing their jobs, flying, surviving, and making it home. Few realized that the invisible liquid coursing through their engines had become one of the most powerful weapons of the war. Back in the labs, the men who created it received no medals, no headlines. Their names were buried under secrecy orders, their work hidden even from the pilots whose lives it saved. But they knew what they'd done. They had changed the course of the war without firing a single bullet. And as autumn approached, with the Luftwaffe in retreat and Allied bombers flying unopposed across Europe, one fact became undeniable: the sky now belonged to America. By the late summer of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. What had once been a proud, ironclad empire of air supremacy was collapsing, slowly at first, then all at once. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, was bleeding from 1,000 invisible wounds. Everywhere the Mustangs appeared, the German pilots could feel it. An unexplainable edge, something supernatural almost, as if their opponents had tapped into an unknown source of power. The truth was simple, though none of them wanted to believe it. It wasn't magic. It was chemistry. The introduction of 150-grade fuel had done more than improve the P-51 Mustang's performance. It had rewritten the laws of air warfare. Each drop of that volatile blend carried a secret advantage, a promise of more speed, more altitude, more thrust than the German engines could ever match. The Luftwaffe's best fighters, once the terror of Allied bombers, were now the hunted, and every mission felt like a desperate chase they couldn't win. At the beginning of 1944, the Germans had sent their best pilots into the skies, confident that their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs could still dictate the rhythm of war. But by August, that rhythm was gone. Entire squadrons vanished. New recruits lasted days before they were cut from the sky. Every dogfight seemed to end the same way. A brief flurry of tracer fire, then silence, broken only by the Mustang's fading roar. The 150-octane fuel had transformed the Mustang's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into something far beyond what it was originally designed for. It could push past 490 miles per hour, climb at impossible angles, and chase German fighters even into steep dives. Maneuvers that once guaranteed escape. Pilots who tried to flee found themselves caught, overtaken, and destroyed in seconds. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was an extermination. The German commanders called emergency meetings, demanding answers. Their radar operators reported increasing numbers of Allied sorties, deeper and faster than ever before. Luftwaffe intelligence intercepted communications, but couldn't decode the secret. They blamed weather patterns, faulty gauges, anything but the truth. That their enemies had unlocked a chemical advantage they could never replicate. Inside their bases, German mechanics worked until their hands bled, trying to squeeze more power from engines already pushed to their limits. They experimented with methanol water injection, synthetic fuel blends, and radical tuning methods, but nothing closed the gap. Meanwhile, Allied airfields in England hummed like factories of death, where crews fueled Mustangs with that gleaming, high-octane liquid and sent them roaring toward Europe. The results were devastating. By September, the Luftwaffe had lost so many experienced pilots that command began assigning rookies with only a few weeks of training. They were boys, barely old enough to shave, thrown into the cockpit of machines they barely understood. Against the Mustang's lethal precision, they never stood a chance. Each mission drained more than just men and planes. It drained hope. The Luftwaffe's morale crumbled as rumors spread of supercharged American fighters that no one could outrun. Pilots began refusing missions, faking mechanical failures, or ejecting early. Fear spread faster than any fuel could burn. The Americans, on the other hand, were entering a new era of dominance. With 150 octane in their tanks, P-51s now escorted bombers from takeoff in England all the way to targets deep inside Germany, Berlin, Munich, and the industrial heartlands of the Reich. The skies above these cities became fields of fire where the Luftwaffe's last defense lines shattered under the relentless pressure. Factories that once produced Messerschmitts now lay in ruins, flattened by the very bombers the Mustangs protected. Supply lines choked, airfields turned into smoking craters. Even the mighty flak guns couldn't keep up with the pace of Allied raids. The psychological toll on Germany's population was immense. Once quiet towns grew accustomed to the endless drone of bombers overhead and the haunting whistle of bombs descending. The once proud German propaganda machine fell silent about the air war. There was no victory to boast about, no hero to celebrate. Only loss. Within the Luftwaffe's command, desperation turned to denial. Some officers clung to the hope that new jet fighters, like the Me-262, would restore balance. But even these technological marvels faced insurmountable problems. Fuel shortages, sabotage, and the Allies' relentless bombardment of airfields. For every new jet that reached the sky, 10 Mustangs were already waiting. Everywhere, the Germans looked up and saw silver wings glinting in the sunlight. The P-51s had become symbols of inevitability, of power that no will or technology could suppress. They hunted not just planes, but the very spirit of German resistance. In the countryside, farmers would stop in their fields and watch the dogfights unfold miles above, streaks of smoke twisting through the clouds. They could tell who was winning by the direction the wreckage fell. The fall of the Luftwaffe wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion, like a building collapsing one brick at a time. Each defeat chipped away at its foundation until nothing remained but shattered pride and smoldering airfields. By late autumn, the Allied command no longer worried about enemy air cover. Their bombers flew in formation with confidence. The once dreaded Luftwaffe had become little more than a rumor, its pilots scattered, its planes grounded for lack of fuel, its legend buried beneath the roar of American engines. And as winter approached, a new sound echoed across the war-torn skies, the deep, confident hum of the Mustang's Merlin engine, powered by 150-grade fire. The Americans now owned not just the skies, but the rhythm of war itself. The men who had developed the fuel, the the quiet chemists and engineers working in obscurity, watched the reports flow in with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. They knew what they had created. They knew that behind every victory, behind every streak of contrail across the sky, was the invisible hand of their invention. But war had a way of consuming everything it touched. Even triumph tasted bitter when weighed against the cost. As the year drew to a close, one truth was undeniable. The Luftwaffe had fallen. Not from lack of courage or skill, but from a single calculated act of innovation. The war in the air was no longer a contest. It was a storm, and the Mustangs were its thunder. Yet, in the ruins of Germany, whispers began to spread. Rumors that the Reich's scientists were preparing something new, something beyond piston engines and fuel chemistry. The Americans didn't know it yet, but their supremacy in the skies would soon face a different kind of challenge. The next chapter of the war was already being written, deep in secret laboratories on both sides of the conflict. By the dawn of 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final act. Cities burned, armies broke, and the once mighty Luftwaffe had become a shadow of its former self. But in that shadow, something new was stirring. A desperate, final gamble by a nation that refused to surrender the sky. The Allies believed they had complete air dominance, and for good reason. Their fleets of bombers flew with confidence. Their Mustangs ruled every altitude, their engines humming with the fierce energy of 150-grade fuel. To most pilots, the war in the air was already won. But beneath the rubble of Germany's collapsing empire, engineers were working on a machine that could change everything. A weapon so fast, so advanced, it bordered on the impossible. They called it the Messerschmitt Me 262. It was sleek, shark-like, and deadly. The world's first operational jet fighter. Powered by twin Junkers Jumo turbojet engines, it could reach speeds over 540 miles per hour, faster than anything the Allies had ever faced. If it had appeared a year earlier, it might have rewritten history. But now, as the Allies pressed deeper into German territory, it arrived too late, flying like a ghost from a dying empire. Still, the jet's mere existence sent a ripple of fear through Allied command. Reports began trickling in from bomber squadrons. Sightings of strange aircraft that appeared out of nowhere, streaking through formations before vanishing into the clouds. Gunners claimed they were fighting metal comets, too fast to track, too powerful to escape. At first, many thought it was a myth. But then, one by one, the reports grew undeniable. Entire bomber wings were being shredded in seconds by these new jet-powered predators. For the first time since the introduction of the 150-octane Mustang, the Americans felt a sliver of uncertainty. Their dominance, built on chemistry and engineering, was being challenged by something beyond their understanding. But the truth was more complex. While the Me 262 was revolutionary, it was also fragile. Its engines were temperamental, often failing mid-flight. Its takeoffs were slow, its landings treacherous. The jet required runways long and clean, something increasingly rare in a country being pounded by Allied bombers. For every jet that made it to the sky, 2 were destroyed on the ground before ever taking off. And waiting for them above, like vultures circling a carcass, were the P-51 Mustangs. Allied intelligence quickly adapted. They knew the Me-262s were nearly invincible in the air, but vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Squadrons of Mustangs were assigned to patrol the skies near known jet bases, hunting the new German miracle before it could even lift from the runway. The strategy was brutal, but effective. Each day, German jet pilots taxied down shattered runways under a rain of strafing gunfire, trying to claw their way into the sky while Mustang rounds ripped through their bases. The P-51s became predators in the purest sense, stalking, ambushing, eliminating. Still, for those few Me-262s that made it aloft, the experience was like stepping into another era of flight. They could dive on Allied bombers, fire their cannons, and disappear before a Mustang could react. Allied crews described the attacks as lightning strikes from the future. But even as the jets screamed through the skies, the reality of collapse became impossible to ignore. There wasn't enough fuel, not enough mechanics, not enough time. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to refine their own advantage. The 150-grade fuel had not only transformed the P-51, but also elevated other Allied aircraft. Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and even bombers were being modified to run on the high-octane blend. Every mission now flew faster, climbed higher, struck deeper. For the Mustang pilots, hunting jets became the new frontier of the air war. They learned to wait, circling near known German airfields at low altitude, listening to radio chatter, watching for the telltale dust cloud of a jet's takeoff. When they spotted one, they'd surge upward, cutting across the climb path like wolves intercepting prey. The dogfights that followed were brief but ferocious. The Me-262s had speed, but the Mustangs had agility, endurance, and overwhelming numbers. The skies became a deadly dance of evolution. The piston engine versus the jet turbine, the old world versus the new. In Berlin, desperate Luftwaffe officers begged Hitler for mass production of the jet. But chaos ruled the Reich now. Factories were bombed to rubble. Materials ran out. Even when jets were built, they couldn't fly without trained pilots or fuel. The war was ending faster than innovation could save it. The Mustang pilots, however, didn't know how close they were to victory. To them, every sortie felt dangerous, uncertain. They were flying into the unknown, chasing something beyond their time. Yet deep inside, they felt the quiet confidence of their own machines. They trusted the roar of their Merlin engines, the chemistry that powered them, the invisible fire that gave them speed no one could match. Each mission reinforced the same truth. No matter how advanced the enemy became, the Mustangs could still fight, still dominate, because of one secret ingredient, one overlooked miracle of human ingenuity. As the jet shadow passed over Europe, the Americans knew they were witnessing the future of warfare. But they also knew that their 150-grade fuel, their creation of speed from chemistry, had bought them the present. And in war, that was all that mattered. By the final months of the conflict, the skies above Germany were littered with contrasts. The dying roar of piston engines, the eerie scream of jet turbines, and the steady, confident hum of Mustangs gliding through the clouds. In the end, the jets came too late to save the Reich. The factories fell, the airfields were captured, and the P-51s continued their relentless patrols, ensuring nothing took to the skies that didn't wear Allied colors. The Me-262 was a marvel of engineering, a glimpse of the future. But the war was won by something simpler, something that turned science into power faster than the enemy could react. A single idea that the chemistry of fuel could decide the fate of nations had changed the outcome of the war. As 1945 unfolded and Allied bombers flew unchallenged over a burning continent, one fact was clear. Even the jet age couldn't outrun the fire in the veins of the Mustang. The war wasn't over yet, but its end was written in vapor trails and burning skies. The Mustang had become more than an aircraft. It was now a symbol of innovation, of inevitability, of dominance. And as the Germans scrambled to unleash their final weapons, they didn't realize the truth that history would remember forever. The age of the jet might have begun, but the sky still belonged to the demons of 150-grade fuel. The winter of 1945 was cruel, but it carried with it the weight of destiny. Europe lay shattered beneath a gray sky, its fields scarred by tanks, its cities reduced to rubble, and its people weary of war. Yet above this broken world, the final chapter of air supremacy was still being written, in vapor trails and engine roars that echoed across the continent. For the pilots of the U.S. 8th Air Force, the mission was clear: protect the bombers all the way to Berlin. The city had become the heart of the dying Reich, and every raid now aimed at finishing what years of firestorms had begun. The Germans were cornered, desperate, and dangerous. But the Americans were relentless, flying higher, faster, and with more power than ever before, thanks to the secret weapon burning in their tanks, 150-grade aviation fuel. It wasn't just a number. It was chemistry turned into victory. With it, the P-51 Mustangs could push their Packard-built Merlin engines beyond limits no engineer had dared imagine months before. The result was astonishing. The planes that once cruised at 430 miles per hour were now tearing through the skies at speeds close to 490, blurring into streaks of silver light. For German soldiers on the ground, it was terrifying. They'd look up and see contrails moving faster than their eyes could track, diving out of the clouds, attacking, vanishing. To them, these weren't aircraft anymore. They were phantoms. Sky demons, one diary called them. And in a way, that's what they were. The Luftwaffe was collapsing. Its once proud fighter wings were grounded by fuel shortages, scattered by bombings, or destroyed before takeoff. The few aircraft that did manage to rise, the FW-190s, BF-109s, and even the precious Me-262 jets, faced a new kind of enemy. One that could chase them, climb faster, and never run out of reach. The 150-octane fuel gave the P-51s a terrifying new confidence. They could engage German aircraft in vertical combat, something once unthinkable. Where older Mustangs would have stalled in steep climbs, these new demons rocketed skyward, flipping from defense to attack in seconds. Each mission became a demonstration of domination. The Mustangs' escorted bombers streamed so vast they darkened the daylight. From horizon to horizon, thousands of planes flew in formation. B-17s and B-24s loaded with destruction, flanked by Silver Guardians ready to tear apart anything that approached. For the German people, every sound of distant thunder now meant another air raid. For the German pilots, it meant another day of fighting ghosts. And for the Mustang squadrons, it meant pushing deeper into a world they had already conquered from above. The men who flew them were not all hardened veterans. Many were just boys, barely 20, but the fuel beneath them turned their machines into gods. They flew over territory that once terrified Allied pilots, the Ruhr, Dresden, and finally Berlin. And they did it without fear. The war in the air had flipped. As the Allies advanced on the ground, the skies became the Americans' domain. Every German convoy, every train, every fuel depot became fair game. The Mustangs descended like vultures, ripping apart anything that moved. Bridges, trucks, locomotives, nothing escaped their wrath. And through it all, the Germans could only look up and wonder, how were these planes so fast, so powerful, so endless? Rumors spread through the ranks that the Allies had developed a new type of engine, or stolen alien technology, or used some mysterious additive. In truth, it was science, not sorcery, the product of relentless American experimentation. Months earlier, British chemists and American engineers had worked side by side, developing this new grade of fuel, a blend capable of handling higher manifold pressures, resisting detonation, and pushing the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine beyond its original limits. What had started as a laboratory formula became a weapon of war. Now, that weapon was rewriting the rules of aerial combat. For the German aces who still dared to fight, every sortie was a suicide mission. They launched from hidden airstrips, often under bombardment, with barely enough fuel to climb. They met the Mustangs in the cold, high air over Saxony and Thuringia, and most never returned. Their last battles were desperate. The Me-262s, fast but fragile, struck like lightning and then disappeared. The FW-190s tried to dive away, but the Mustangs followed, their engines howling with boosted fury. The BF-109s, once kings of the sky, were now prey. The Luftwaffe's downfall wasn't just about numbers or tactics. It was about evolution. The Germans had run out of time to adapt, while the Americans had found a way to stretch their machines beyond physics itself. Each day, Allied intelligence noted the same pattern: fewer enemy fighters, fewer sorties, fewer signs of resistance. And each day, the Mustang pilots flew farther east. Their missions now stretched across half of Europe, from England to the outskirts of Berlin. Berlin, the symbol of everything the war had become, the broken capital of a crumbling empire. As winter melted into spring, the final raids began. The city's anti-aircraft guns fired until their barrels melted. But it didn't matter. The bombers came in waves, escorted by Mustangs that moved like lightning. German flak gunners couldn't track them. Their bursts of fire exploded harmlessly behind the speeding fighters. From above, the city looked like a dying machine, a heart still beating but already broken. The P-51s weren't just flying missions anymore. They were making history. They had turned from protectors to predators, sweeping the skies clean before the bombers arrived. Their pilots knew the end was near. Every mission carried the same whisper through the radio: Berlin next. And as the Allied armies closed in from all sides, the Mustang pilots made sure the enemy never had the chance to regroup. Fuel depots were destroyed. Rail yards were vaporized. Communication lines were cut. By the time the first American tanks rolled toward the capital, the Luftwaffe was gone, erased not by bombs or bullets, but by chemistry and speed. The final days of the war were filled with strange quiet. The once constant dogfights had faded away. The sky belonged to no one but the silver wings of the Mustangs, glinting in the sunlight as they flew their victory laps over a defeated land. The Germans had created machines that defied imagination, but the Americans had mastered something deeper, the art of power itself. And as the world's fastest propeller-driven fighter cruised over Berlin's burning skyline, it carried with it not just the end of one war, but the beginning of a new era of warfare. For the men who flew them, the feeling was bittersweet. They had won the skies, but at a cost too heavy to forget. The war was nearly over, yet the echoes of its engines would haunt the world for generations. As the Mustangs turned west for the last time, their exhaust trails fading in the distance, the sky over Germany fell silent. And in that silence, one truth remained. The Germans had never expected that a simple change in fuel could summon such power. Power that turned machines into monsters and pilots into legends. The race to Berlin was over. But the legacy of the 150-grade demons had only just begun. Thunder of war was fading, but its echoes still trembled across Europe. The spring of 1945 brought with it a strange silence. A silence not of peace, but of exhaustion. The Luftwaffe was gone. The mighty German Air Force that once ruled the skies with iron precision and unmatched skill now lay in ruins. Airfields stood empty, hangars burned out, and the once proud pilots had become prisoners of history. Above it all, the P-51 Mustangs still roamed, the kings of a conquered sky. They had become more than machines of war. They were symbols of dominance, of innovation, and of the terrifying power of progress. Yet beneath their polished silver skins, they carried the ghosts of what they had done and what it had cost to get there. By April, the Allies had full control of the air. The few remaining German aircraft dared not rise. The flak guns that had once lit the skies were silent now, their barrels twisted and blackened. The Mustang pilots flew over fields once riddled with anti-aircraft bursts, now covered in smoke and wreckage. From the air, the roads below looked like scars, endless lines of broken vehicles, shattered tanks, and columns of surrendering soldiers. The war had ended for many, but the missions continued. There were still reconnaissance flights to make, still isolated German pockets that hadn't received the order to lay down their arms. Each mission now felt different, quieter, colder, more reflective. The thrill of combat was replaced by a heavy stillness, the kind that follows a storm too long endured. The pilots had changed too. They were no longer the eager young men who once grinned for photographs beside their Mustangs. They had seen too much, lost too many friends. Each engine startup carried a weight, not of fear, but of memory. They had survived a kind of war that chewed through men as easily as it did metal. In England, the airfields that had once roared with constant activity now stood half empty. Mechanics lounged against their toolboxes, waiting for orders that would never come. The crews that once rushed to arm and refuel the Mustangs now moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as if unsure what to do with peace. Word spread quickly. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. When the announcement came, the airfield erupted in celebration. Men cheered, laughed, and wept all at once. Some threw their caps into the air, others stood motionless, unable to believe that the nightmare was finally over. But for the Mustang pilots, the victory felt different. They had won, yes, but they had also changed forever. They had seen what speed could do, what power could unleash. They had witnessed the transformation of war from human courage to mechanical supremacy. And deep down, they knew this was only the beginning. The 150-grade fuel that had given them their edge, that invisible miracle that had turned the tide of air combat, was now the blueprint for the next generation of warfare. Engineers were already experimenting with jet propulsion, new fuels, new materials. The days of propeller-driven combat were ending. The Mustangs were magnificent, but they were also the last of their kind. For a brief, shining moment, they had ruled the sky absolutely. But history was already moving on. In captured German research facilities, Allied scientists pored over blueprints for jet engines and rocket planes. They discovered projects so advanced, they seemed like science fiction. The Germans had been close, dangerously close, to creating weapons that could have changed everything. But they had run out of fuel, out of time, and out of luck. The Americans, with their refineries, their engineers, and their 150-octane innovation, had simply outrun them. As summer came, the Mustangs began their final missions, not in battle, but in occupation. They patrolled skies over a defeated Germany, flying low over cities that now lay in ashes. The pilots looked down and saw what victory really looked like: broken homes, empty streets, hungry faces staring up at the planes that had once been their terror. For many of the pilots, it was a sobering realization. They had helped bring about the end, but also the destruction. The pride of triumph mixed uneasily with guilt. They had fought for freedom, yes, but freedom had come at a terrible price. The Mustangs landed one last time in Europe that summer. Their engines cooled for the final time over German soil. Some would be shipped back to America, others left behind, abandoned on foreign runways. Their wings still gleamed, their fuselages still bore the names of lost friends. But their purpose was gone. The world was entering a new age, one where speed and power would define not just warfare, but the very idea of human achievement. The same chemistry that had made the Mustang unstoppable would soon fuel jet fighters, bombers, and even rockets. The 150-octane fuel had done more than win battles. It had opened a door that could never be closed. Back in the United States, the returning pilots were hailed as heroes. Parades filled the streets. Newspapers printed photos of the P-51s with headlines like "The Fighters That Won the Sky." But behind every smiling face was a memory. The roar of the engine, the flash of tracers, the shadow of a dogfight that no one on the ground could truly understand. In quiet moments, those who had flown the 490-mile-per-hour Demons found themselves listening for sounds that no longer came. The whistle of wind over the canopy, the thump of the propeller, the hiss of boosted fuel burning at impossible pressures. They had lived at the edge of human capability, riding machines that had defied reason. And now, they were just men again. Years later, historians would call it the golden age of flight. Engineers would study the P-51 and marvel at how a simple change, a denser, higher-octane fuel, could have rewritten the balance of power in a global war. They would say that it wasn't luck that won the skies, but ingenuity. That America's victory came not from numbers, but from the mind, from the ability to think faster, refine better, and push harder. And they would be right. But for the men who were there, the truth was simpler. The war had taught them that every advantage came with a cost. Every miracle had its shadow. The 150-grade fuel had turned their Mustangs into legends. But it had also turned the sky into a place of ghosts. As the last surviving Mustangs were retired, their polished wings gleaming in museum hangars, the old pilots would stand beside them in silence. They'd run their hands along the metal, feeling the faint vibration of memories. The roar of engines, the flash of sunlight, the taste of fear and victory. They knew what few others did. That once, for a brief and terrible time, they had flown faster than fear itself. And that somewhere, high above the ruins of Europe, the echo of those 490 miles per hour Demons still circled, unseen, unheard, but never forgotten. The Germans never expected that a few drops of 150-grade fuel would change the course of history and turn the sky itself into a weapon.